today we hear from Timothy. He says this: "It took us a night and a day and a night again to carry Paul from Ephesus to Smyrna. 40 miles. The first 15 in grim haste, despite a sheeting rain and lightning in the night. Fog shrouded us the following morning, and still we did not stop. Good to be cloaked if someone was chasing us. Good to be ghosts on the road. The four of us, Demas, Luke, Justus, and me, we bore Paul along on a piece of leather he'd cut himself. Luke had thought to cover him with it, but when the others saw the apostle was as good as dead, we lashed short poles into a narrow frame and sewed the leather around it. I did the sewing, with an awl and some cord from Paul's bag. I used a basting stitch, of which no one would be proud, but I'd only learned it by watching Paul, and I had neither the time nor the light to do a proper job. We drew Prisca's toga over him, then clutched the rude litter at the corners and ran. He didn't wake the entire time. At least I don't think he woke. Now and again, I saw an eyelid open halfway to the daylight, but the pupil was blank, and his head rocked in rhythm with our going, as if it were as mindless as a melon. His arms fell out. His poor wasted arms dropped out of the litter. I kept tucking them under his sides, but I couldn't unball his fist. His jaw was locked. This seemed a sleep too mortal, and I worried. I watched him while we drove forward. I was scared that the man was dying. My papa told me once that Homer was born in Smyrna, that blind old seer, the singer my papa loved. Then he threw back his head and laughed. The laughter turned, as it always did, to coughing and a pinkish foam. They claim him, they claim the man is their own, Papa said when he got his breath again. But they don't know the last thing about him, not the last thing. In the gray dawn of the second morning, we slipped into Smyrna, exhausted, but traveling still as quickly as we could go. We feared that 4 men with a 5th on a bed between them would draw suspicion. In Smyrna, the streets are so perfectly straight, so perfectly parallel east and west, that the sea breeze blew unbroken from the harbor, while the sunrise raised a blister in the east, and we were caught between. 2 miles north of Smyrna, rushing toward Pergamum now, my stitches ripped, and Paul fell through the pole frame, hitting the road below. "Oh no," I cried, frightened for Paul, furious with myself. I dropped to my knees, and for an instant I thought I saw life in the body, or else the draining of his life. Paul rolled to his side and drew his knees to his chest. Paul, are you all right?" No answer. None. His right temple was wormy with a blue vein and as pale as ivory. His nose was too prominent, his eyelids so thin as to seem translucent, the eyeballs crossed beneath them. And his jaw was locked and his fists were balled. "Paul?" We stopped where we were. We carried him into a low entrance of stone, where the other 3 fell asleep while I restitched his narrow bed, watching his tight, unconscious body on Prisca's beautiful robe. "Oh, Paul, I'm so sorry." When I had finished a tighter stitch, a seam stitch this time, I woke Luke and asked him to watch while I ran back to the city. I bought my friend a pillow. I ran back and placed a little cushion under his head, and then I collapsed. I cannot remember falling asleep. I see Luke pouring water onto Paul's lips as if the two men were great clouds bowed together in the heavens. And then I see nothing. On the third day, Paul woke up, just at noon, suddenly, and began quietly to cry. We were about halfway to Pergamum, skirting high ground on our right. The day was bright, the sun behind us and warm on our shoulders. The breezes more earthy than salty here, and the air made moist with the breathings of a vernal soil. I was walking at the back of the litter, the left side, considering for the first time in a month that this was the season of the Passover. I wondered at myself, at all of us, really, how could we have forgotten the feast? We were forgetting our heritage. Had the festivals begun to fall away from us without our even noticing? But immediate events had been so consuming that we had no time for anything else. Paul's imprisonment, fear of the trial to come, fear for his life. And the failure of the Galatian churches and the horrors of Corinth, Prisca's heroic sacrifice. When was the Passover? Which day? I truly didn't know. Justus was Jewish, more Jewish than me, since his father had not been Greek. I asked him, which day is the Passover? Without looking around, he answered me, the night you brought Paul to us, that was the start of the Passover. Who had celebrated? Had my mother found a family to share with her the bread, the bitter herbs, the lamb, and the wine in the story? But Lystra's Jewless. Surely that man in Jerusalem solemnly had set a table with others like him, a host of others, I suppose. That man whom Paul knows, James. Had Barnabas? But we didn't even think about it. Didn't feel the world change, didn't hear the ancients call us or accuse us. I said to Justus, did you miss it? And he said to me, miss what? I walked mechanically. I walked all full of thought, abstracted from the world around me, allowing my eyes to settle without seeing. But slowly, I became aware that my eyes had settled on Paul, on his face in the litter before me. And then the seeing turned electric. Paul was looking back at me. He was awake. He had woken from his deadly sleep, and there were tears leaking from the corners of his eyes, smearing his temples. Paul, I squeaked. The words stuck in me. I coughed. I cleared my throat hard and cried, stop, to the others. Look, Paul's here. Paul's awake. Swiftly, we lowered the bed to the ground and turned all four to look down on him. Down on my dear brother, my friend, whose eyes were shining, whose brow was lifted in childlike questions, whose bottom lip was trembling gently, and who gazed up at us one by one and each by each. Who gave me a pillow? He said. His voice was thick with emotion, and at his speaking, the tears rolled down in a great flow. Who? Paul begged, raising his hands and spreading his fingers as if to hold some delicate bowl in them. Who was so kind as to put a pillow under my head?